Subjective and objective. So often you hear these words used in debates concerning ethics, art, science and politics. But what do they actually mean? Well, there's a lot of confusion and disagreement on the meaning of these words, and therefore I thought it would be nice to make an analysis. Let's do this in two parts. First, look at how these words can be defined, and second, at how they are being used. Now, obviously, the words subjective and objective are derived from the words subject and object. From a philosophical perspective, a subject is a thinking or feeling entity, the conscious mind, as opposed to anything external to it. So a subject is basically just a person, a human being, whilst an object is a material thing that can be seen and touched, a thing to which a specific action or feeling is directed. So basically an object is a thing, something outside of the subject that the subject encounters. So if we compare the two, we can say that a subject is a who and an object is a what. And in relationship with each other, that will mean that a subject is, for instance, who observes, and an object is what is being observed. A subject is who experiences, and an object is what is experienced. And a subject is who judges, and an object is what is being judged. So based on that, there's quite a variety of what the words subjective and objective can mean. It can mean the subjective internal self versus the objective external world. Subjective perceptions of experiences of the world and the objective physical world itself. Subjective feelings versus objective facts. Subjective normative statements that contain values, and objective descriptive statements that are neutral. Subjective opinions versus objective truth. Subjective tastes versus things based on objective rational proof. Subjective unverifiable statements against objective verifiable statements. And what subjective is what applies only to an individual, and what is objective applies universally. So very different interpretations. But what you see is that in all cases, the words subjective and objective are understood as binary opposites. So that means that what is subjective is not objective, and what's objective is not subjective. So in other words, you can say that subjective means free from objectivity, and objective means free from subjectivity. And this is actually where we can ask a question. Is this actually possible? Is it possible for something to be free from objectivity? And is it possible for something to be free from subjectivity? Because if this is not possible, the distinction, and therefore the words subjective and objective themselves, don't make any sense. Now, there are quite some reasons as to why subjectivity isn't even possible, and we can name 6 of them here. The first reason why subjectivity doesn't even exist is because subjects are only subjects to themselves, but for other subjects, subjects are objects. And that is because every subject can be observed by other subjects. What is internal for one subject is external for another. So therefore, what is subjective can never be non-objective. For whatever attitudes or feelings you might have, for all who observe you, they belong to the realm of objectivity. In language, this is very clear, in how subjective statements can be easily translated into objective statements. For instance, if Dennis says, "I like cheese," that will be a subjective statement, but it means exactly the same as the objective statement, "Dennis likes cheese." A second reason why subjectivity doesn't even exist is because subjective attitudes can be understood as properties of objects. And this is again very clearly demonstrable in language, in terms that the subjective sentence, "I like apple pie," means exactly the same as the sentence, "Apple pie is being liked by me." So a subjective opinion or experience of an object can always be translated and seen as an factual property of that object. It's a fact about apple pie that I like it. So what we see is you can't have an attitude towards an object without influencing that object. But there's even another reason why subjectivity doesn't exist, and that is because subjective attitudes are themselves objects. So our feelings, our opinions, our perceptions are not something we are, they're things we have. And that means that we can actually make true or false statements about our subjective attitudes. So I can, for instance, lie about that I like apple pie. Also, our opinions are not necessarily things we choose, because I can, for instance, want to like a movie but still not like it. Or we can even be confused about them, in the sense that you can be in denial that you love someone. So feelings, emotions, opinions, experiences are not elements of a subject, but rather things a subject has to deal with. And in many cases, they're obstacles that subjects have to deal with. The fourth reason that subjectivity doesn't exist is that we can also be knowledgeable of subjective attitudes. So this is a reply to the idea that only objective things are verifiable. But actually, subjective things are verifiable, in the sense that we can learn to understand our own emotions, thoughts, and beliefs better. And we can also learn about the subjective experience of other subjects through watching their behavior, listening to their testimony, and through our empathic ability. Now, the fifth reason why subjectivity doesn't exist is a reply to the idea that subjectivity means relative. So sometimes people, by subjective and objective, mean to say relative versus absolute, or particular versus universal, or unchanging. Now, even though this is a bit weird, because the word object means a thing, and it's clear that a thing is bound to a place and time. So objects are not necessarily unchanging or absolute or universal. They are particular, and they also always exist in relationship to other objects. But it is these relationships themselves that are objective. So for instance, when a plant is standing on the top of a table, it is an objective fact about the plant that it stands on top of the table. And this also applies to relative subjective statements. For instance, the statement, "it is raining," you could say is relative, for whether it is true depends on where and when it is said. But this clearly doesn't mean that whether it rains is a matter of subjectivity. It only means that the statement refers to an objective relationship between the subject's position and the rain's position. So the statement could be translated to, it is raining where I am at the moment, and where that subject is, that is objective. Now, this idea also applies to other statements. So, for example, if two friends go to Paris to visit the Eiffel Tower, it could be that one friend would say, wow, the Eiffel Tower is really big, whilst the other would say, well, actually, I think it's quite small. Now, maybe this would make you think that whether the Eiffel Tower is big isn't objective. But this isn't necessarily true, because what this means is that the Eiffel Tower is simply bigger than what the first friend expected, and smaller than what the second friend expected. So also here, there are objective relationships. Objective relationships between the Eiffel Tower size and the expectations of the two friends. So the word relative doesn't mean non-objective, for the relationships between objects are themselves objective. The last reason as to why subjectivity, understood as non-objectivity, doesn't exist is a reply to the idea that subjectivity refers to prescriptive statements and objectivity to descriptive statements. And prescriptive statements mean judgments on human behavior, so how humans should act, basically ethics. The idea that prescriptive statements are subjective is false, because all prescriptive statements are objective claims, and so if they are not objective, then they are by definition false. And this is again very clear if we take a look at language. For example, the prescriptive statement, the government needs to fight climate change, could be translated to, people who think the government shouldn't fight climate change are wrong. So as we see, this statement isn't merely saying something about a specific subject, but about all subjects in general. Everyone who disagrees is wrong. And a statement that applies to everyone is usually considered objective. Now, if this statement isn't meant to say that people who disagree are wrong, then that statement loses its prescriptive nature. For then it would mean that when the government themselves think they don't need to fight climate change, they wouldn't be wrong, and so that would be alright. So the objective claim within prescriptive statements lies in that sense of obligation. And that means you have to do something regardless of what you think yourself. So not because what you think yourself, but regardless of it. The government should fight climate change even if they think they don't. Or in other words, you can be wrong even if you think you are right. And that is the essence of ethical statement. But this is also the essence of facts, or the truth. Things are true regardless of your opinion. And truth and facts are considered to be what is objective. If you can be wrong about ethics, that means that you are not the author of ethics. For otherwise, you can just think you are right or declare that you are right, and you will be right, because you get to decide. But this is not the idea of ethics. Ethics means you can be wrong about ethics. And that means the source of ethics is external to every subject it applies to. So if the government can be wrong, the source of ethics lies outside of the government's subjective opinion. That prescriptive statements are objective claims is also clear from the fact that subjects spend a lot of time in deep thought and discussion and doubt and looking for justification when they are constructing ethical statements. Now, if you can't be wrong about ethics, none of this would make sense. Why doubt what is right if you can't be wrong? Why change your position if you can't be wrong? Why be afraid to do something wrong when you can't? The fact that subjects believe they can be wrong about ethics means that they believe that they are not the source of ethics, and therefore that ethics isn't strictly subjective. The idea that the source of ethics is external to the subjects it applies to is also reflected in the fact that goals are called objectives. Goals are things we as subjects move towards, and in doing so, we adapt ourselves towards the objectives. It is the subjects that are meant to change their behavior according to the objectives, and not the other way around. Now, you could argue that ethics is based on agreement between subjects, so that ethics only exists as the sum of opinions of a group of subjects. But that would mean that if a society comes to an agreement, then that agreement can't be wrong. But this is not what people usually mean by ethics, because we can, for instance, imagine a society where people have come to the agreement that homosexuals should be thrown off a cliff. And we can even imagine a society where the people are so brainwashed that they themselves believe they deserve being thrown off a cliff. But we still think that even though they all agree, they still can be wrong. And if an entire society can be wrong, then that society is not the author of ethics. So these are the 6 reasons why subjectivity cannot exist, meaning freedom from objectivity, because there always seems to be objectivity. That is because subjects are also objects. Subjective attitudes are properties of objects. Subjective attitudes are themselves objects, and they're objects you can be knowledgeable about. All relationships are themselves objective, so there's also not something relative in the sense that it's not objective. And if prescriptive statements are subjective, they are per definition meaningless. The meaning of a prescriptive statement is that it's an objective claim. But now, if subjectivity doesn't exist, does that mean that everything is objective? Well, we first have to see if we understand objectivity as freedom from subjectivity. Does that even exist? Is it possible to be completely non-subjective? Now, as it turns out, there's also a lot of reasons why objectivity doesn't exist. For with every statement or situation, you can always detect some subjective influences, like personal experiences, feelings, tastes, and opinions. I will show 5 reasons for this. The first reason why we can't get rid of our subjective influences is that our only gateway to the world is through our subjective faculties. It requires a subject with subjective faculties to even have knowledge of the world, for only subjects can observe, only subjects can reason and judge, and only subjects can have knowledge. The call for objective evidence or objective reasoning as basis for knowledge is in fact a call for experience, which is a subjective faculty, and a call for reasoning, which is also a subjective faculty. Now, if you would have different faculties because you were a different type of subject, let's say a dog, you would have a very different knowledge of the world. Dogs have a much smaller, if any, capacity for reasoning, and that changes how they understand the world. But dogs also have a much better smell than humans. So if you imagine that humans had the same ability to smell as dogs, then our entire body of science would look very different, because we would have written much more about smells. So there's definitely an influence here. The second reason that we can't overcome our subjective influences is because objectivity is not neutral, and that is because objectivity is itself an ideal. Neutrality is not the opposite of values, because neutrality is a value. And this is because neutrality is not something that is inevitably, but it's something we strive for. It's something we want to achieve. There is nothing forcing us to be interested in objective truth. There's nothing forcing us to be rational. It's perfectly possible to just have irrational thoughts for your entire life. And there's also nothing forcing us to overcome our feelings to get objective knowledge. All these things only arise after a desire for truth, a desire for rationality, and a desire for objectivity. Hope, love, and passion for science precede the fruits of science, and science is only there because there were subjects who thought it would be interesting, appealing, beautiful, meaningful, important, and relevant. And without those subjective attitudes, science would not only have no validity, it would simply disappear. And this is also why scientists all over the world are very concerned with making people and children enthusiastic about science, because they know that without this interest and curiosity, science wouldn't exist. The third influence of subjectivity that is always there is the limitation of our mind and of our language. Simply because the quantity of facts is so much larger than what a brain can handle. This means that our knowledge is always incomplete. But if your knowledge is incomplete, you can never be sure that you are right, because you can never exclude that there is some facts that change significantly what you're talking about. Also, because there's so much to know, we always have to choose what we are going to research. So there's always an aspect of what we think is relevant that defines our knowledge. And this idea of relevance is subjective. But not only our mind is limited, but also our language is very limited. That is because descriptions are always simplifications of reality. They never contain all information of what they describe. And the information that they contain, or that they refer to, is therefore also never really clear. And let's take a look at another example of language. The phrase René Descartes was French looks like a perfectly simple objective statement. But if you question what does this actually mean, what does it mean to be French, this isn't clear at all. Is this a legal reality? Is this a cultural reality? An identitarian reality? Does this say where he was born, or who his parents were, or simply where he spent most of his time? Well, actually, René Descartes spent most of his time in the Netherlands? And also, does what we mean by French even fairly reflect the reality of France in the time of Descartes? The inevitable vagueness of language is filled in with associations, and the meaning of words therefore also lies in these associations. But these associations differ heavily from subject to subject. There is no definite understanding what it means to be French. The fourth inevitable manifestation of subjectivity lies in the fact that we can't not affect the world when observing it or describing it. So we are always affecting that what we observe and describe. And this is because observation and description are basically forms of interaction, an interaction between subject and objects. But the reality of the objects change in this interaction. For instance, after I've seen a tree, it's an objective fact about that tree that I've seen it. And likewise, when the Europeans discovered the existence of America, they changed the meaning of what America was. For how the discovery of the Americas affected the history of humanity is part of its objective reality. Now, this is inevitable because when we observe, we basically establish a causal relationship between the object, which causes us to see it, and therefore the meaning of the object changes because now it has become a cause for us seeing it, and thereby it has started a chain reaction in the history of the world. The last reason why we can never get rid of our subjective influences is because nothing seems self-evident. Whatever fundaments of knowledge we propose, we can always deny them. We can deny the ability of our senses and what they produce, the ability of reason. We can deny that we have agency or freedom. We can deny that causality is necessary and that it's consistent. We can deny the existence of anything outside our experience. We can even deny that our thoughts and behavior have any meaning at all. So, in the end, everything that we produce is subjective because it requires us not to be that kind of subject. We simply have to conclude that there is always an influence of subjectivity. And this is because our only path to reality is through our subjective faculties. It is because objectivity is itself an ideal, so it can never be value-free. It is because of the limitations of our mind and of our language, in terms of quantity and of exactness. It is because we always affect that what we observe and describe. And it is because nothing seems self-evident in the end. So to achieve anything, subjects always need to play along. Now the situation that we find ourselves in is pretty awkward because subjective and objective are understood as opposites, but both are incoherent. And this actually creates a very dangerous trap, the trap of negation, because by disproving one side, you would think you have proven the other side, because that's how opposites work. If things cannot be subjective, surely everything must be objective. But if things can't be objective, surely everything must be subjective. But it is because this opposition isn't true. Disproving one side doesn't prove yours. The fact that the other side is wrong doesn't mean that you are right. So let's see where exactly the error lies in the common understanding of these words. The riddle of the subjectivity-objectivity distinction is actually quite easily solved, because the problem lies in the error of the man-world dualism, the idea that you can make a separation between the subject and the world the subject is living in. But in fact, the subject is part of the world he's living in. That is what being in the world means. And therefore any distinction between subjectivity and objectivity is nonsense. To say that subjectivity is the opposite of objectivity is like saying cheese is the opposite of food. But cheese can never be the opposite of food because it is food. Now both the idea of objectivity and the idea of subjectivity create a separation between the world and the subject. They declare a form of independence. The objectivist treats the descriptions of the world as being independent from the world. It creates a fiction of the objective perspective, as if there is this perspective which is outside of the world that we can take in. However, we can't step outside of the world to perceive it. We always perceiving the world from within. The subjectivist, on the other hand, places their assessment of the world outside of the world, and thereby they create the fiction of a private reality. They pretend that subjective opinions, feelings, experiences are not in fact part of the world. But in fact they are part of the world, because we subjects live in the world. So everything that we produce and everything that goes on in our minds is also part of reality. We can use the following analogy to picture the two different errors. The subjectivist is like a person in a car that puts a bag over his head and then say, I'm not in the car, I'm in my bag. But the fact that their head is in the bag doesn't mean they're also inside of the car. The objectivist is like the driver of the car trying to figure out where the car is going, not realizing that they're behind the wheel and whatever they do is where the car is going. So when they are trying to figure out where it's going, they're actually deciding where it's going. The difference between the subjectivist and the objectivist can also be understood by where their thinking starts. The subjectivist tries to start thinking from subjectivity, but you can't, because we are already an object before we start. The objectivist tries to start thinking from objectivity, but also that is impossible because we are also already a subject before we start thinking. So the mistake is to think that either the subject or the object precedes the other. But this is false because they are one and the same. This unity between subject and object is because when you are inside the world, looking for origins is the same as looking for ends. Because when you're looking for an origin, that is your end, to get to the origin. And this is also why you can't separate ends from their origins. Because when you adopt an end, you have also adopted its origin. An example of this is the statement, "There is no meaning in the world, but we give it meaning." Well, aren't you part of the world? Didn't the world produce you, and thereby also everything that you in turn produce? An objectivist would believe that you can independently establish the origins, and the subjectivist believes that you can independently establish ends. These premises are the error in both worldviews. The point of unification of subjectivity and objectivity lies in our mind, in our thoughts, because things we have are objects to us, but what we are is what is subjective about us. But in having thoughts, you can't really distinct between what you have and what you are, because we have thoughts, but we also are our thoughts. And because there is no clear place where to draw the line between where subjectivity starts and objectivity ends, or where subjectivity ends and objectivity starts, we can't really construct a worldview based on either of the principles. Now, this issue is typical for modern philosophy and modern society, because when we, for instance, look at the Christian worldview, they don't try to make this distinction between origins and ends, or values and facts, because they are all one inside of God. God is the origin of the world and the end. He is truth and simultaneously goodness. And this also means that for people, there's also not a very big difference between knowing and acting, because they are one in belief. In Christian philosophy, belief is not just an opinion or an idea, but it is an act. It is something you do. It's a relationship you have. It is rituals you perform. Now, knowing how difficult this distinction between objective and subjective is, and how philosophical it is, and evasive, and incomprehensible, and confusing, the big question is, why does everybody keep using these words? What do people mean when they use these words? Is there maybe a function that explains why the words are so popular? Now, I've got the impression that the word subjective is used to deal with the fact that a lot of expressive language is hyperbolic. So when people express themselves, they tend to do it in superlatives. For instance, when they like an artist, they would easily say they're the best artist in the world. Now, when you would take such expressive language literally, that would often create conflict, or it seems that it would create conflict. Now, the word subjective is there to point out that to have a conflict on this issue would be pointless. Now, this is also why it makes sense that there's so little agreement on what is subjective and what is objective. Because there's simply also a lot of disagreement as to which conflicts are pointless. For instance, for a person who is not interested in science or philosophy, it's very easy to say that truth is subjective or that truth doesn't exist, for it would justify their lack of interest and they wouldn't lose anything. But for scientists, they do have to acknowledge objective truth because they do want to resolve questions of truth, and if truth is subjective, there is no basis for that. In the same way, a politician is very unlikely to say that morality is subjective, because they want to convince others of their position. They want that engagement, for they want to settle morality. And that morality is subjective has no place in their argument. This also applies to art educators, critics, or jury members in art competitions. Insofar as they want to communicate or establish their view, it simply isn't helpful to say it is all subjective. Another great example is the phrase universal human rights. Now, what is it that makes these rights supposedly universal? Is this based on an epistemological, philosophical, rational argument, or a coherent categorical understanding of the realms of subjectivity and objectivity? No. The word universal arises from a desire to influence and force a change in the position and behavior of others. And that desire requires an objective claim. It is for the same reason that the same politicians might say that religion is subjective. And again, this is not based on a philosophical argument. It simply expresses that they don't think religion is something worth fighting over, because maybe they would think that agreement is anyway impossible. They don't want this conflict in society, so therefore they just say it is subjective. Let everybody have their own religion, and that will be that. So the social meaning of the word objective is basically the desire to change someone else's mind or to reach common ground with another subject. And it's an expression of the hope that this is possible. Whilst the word subjective is actually a desire to evade conversation and thereby conflict or criticism by basically agreeing to disagree.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
So there are basically two zones where a person can position himself in a conversation. One is the safety zone, where they're free from criticism. That's the idea that everybody can have their own truth. But that's also a isolated zone, because you can't really learn from each other in that way. Whilst you also have a conflict zone, where there is one truth for all. And yeah, the conflict can be tough, but it's also the place where people can reach common ground and reach community. So depending on what you want is depending on which zone you're going to be, and that will also explain your use of the words subjective and objective. Now there are a couple of transgressions of the two zones, and that is when the nature of the zone is not respected. For instance, what you have is what can be called the belief contradiction. And this occurs when a person makes an objective claim and simultaneously denying that objectivity. For instance, when a person states that truth doesn't exist and not realizing that this is itself a truth claim. Another example is when people claim that their moral position is subjective, but then that it still should apply to everybody else. Or another example is claiming that something is a matter of taste, but then still wanting to critique the taste of others, as if they are invalid. The second transgression of the two zones is when people use the words subjective and objective themselves as a means to criticize another. And this can be called the meta-complaint. And this happens, for instance, when someone hears something they dislike, that they would attack that position by saying what they say is subjective. But as a critique, this doesn't make any sense, because if something is subjective, why wouldn't someone be allowed to express their subjective opinion? If something is subjective, then people are 100% entitled to have their own opinion, whatever it is. So here the word subjective is simply an attempt to make someone with a different opinion shut up. But this can also be done by the word objective. So sometimes people try to evade criticism by making the claim that they own the objective truth, and that therefore every critique is invalid. However, the claim of objectivity is obviously not an argument for your position. The third transgression of the zones is when someone switches from one zone to the other at their own convenience. This you can call the subjectivity dive. And it happens when someone fervently argues for a certain position, but then when someone else gives a counter-argument, they would suddenly say, well, it's just my personal opinion. Or they would say, am I not allowed to have my personal opinion? Now obviously it's quite pathetic to leave a debate the moment your opponent starts laying out their argument. So the reason why the words objective and subjective are so popular might actually be because they're very efficient maneuvers in engaging or evading conversation and criticism. Now, I would like to end by pointing out that the words subjective and objective really are necessary. The meaning of the words is so inconsistent, and they're also used to mean so many different things. They really mostly create confusion. Now, if you want to use the words subjective and objective in a specific way, it is much better to use the specific words. So, if you want to distinguish between normative statements and descriptive statements, just use those two terms. If you want to distinguish truth from opinion, just use those words. If you want to distinguish between the internal mind and the physical world, just use those words. You will clarify yourself much better by evading the words subjective and objective. And if you want to use the word subjective and objective to maneuver yourself in or out of an argument, it's much more honest to just say that. Just say you're not interested in the argument and not interested to justify yourself, or say that you do want to have the argument and by that learn from each other's position. So yeah, that's actually my advice. Just don't use these words. You will not miss them.